My world, during those early elementary years, was a kaleidoscope of vibrant colors and boundless energy, yet within its cheerful facade, a shadow loomed large in the form of Mrs. Albright. She was a woman of stern demeanor and even sterner beliefs, her faith a shield she wielded with unwavering conviction, often against those she deemed straying from her narrow path. And I, it seemed, was one such stray. From the moment I stepped into her classroom, a cold, unspoken judgment seemed to settle upon me, a stark contrast to the warmth she reserved for others, particularly for one boy, Mark. Mark was the quintessential golden child in Mrs. Albright's eyes. Bright, articulate, and seemingly incapable of wrongdoing, at least in her presence. But away from her watchful gaze, he was a different creature entirely. A master of subtle torment, a purveyor of whispered insults and sly shoves, his innocent smile a perfect cover for his cruel intentions. My interactions with Mark were rarely voluntary, always orchestrated by Mrs. Albright. "Eleanor," she'd often say, her voice laced with an almost saccharine sweetness that never quite reached her eyes. "Mark needs a little help with his arithmetic. Why don't you sit with him and guide him through it?" Or, "Eleanor, you're so good at organizing, perhaps you could assist Mark with his project materials." It was a constant, relentless pairing, a forced proximity that grated on my nerves and fueled a simmering resentment. She knew we didn't get along, it was palpable, a tension that hung heavy in the air whenever we were forced to collaborate. Yet, she persisted, seemingly oblivious to the friction, or perhaps, enjoying the subtle discomfort it caused me. Each forced interaction was a tiny chip at my patience, a slow erosion of my youthful innocence. I remember the way my stomach would clench when her gaze landed on me, the way my shoulders would instinctively hunch, bracing for the inevitable command that would tether me to Mark's side. It wasn't just the forced collaboration that stung, it was the blatant favoritism, the way her eyes would soften when she looked at him, a stark contrast to the perpetual disapproval etched on her face when she looked at me. It felt like I was perpetually under a microscope, every move scrutinized, every word weighed and found wanting, while Mark glided through the days, bathed in the warm glow of her unwavering approval. The classroom, which should have been a sanctuary of learning and growth, became a stage for this quiet, relentless drama, a place where I felt increasingly isolated and misunderstood. My attempts to simply exist, to learn, to be a child, were constantly interrupted by the imposition of this unwanted dynamic, a dynamic that seemed designed to highlight my perceived flaws and his imagined perfections. The forced proximity with Mark wasn't just an annoyance, it was an open invitation for his particular brand of cruelty. He was a master of the subtle jab, the whispered insult delivered just out of earshot of any adult, the accidental trip that somehow always seemed to happen when I was carrying something fragile. He'd hide my pencils, smudge my artwork, or accidentally spill water on my homework, all while maintaining an angelic facade that Mrs. Albright never questioned. My attempts to defend myself, or even just to point out his transgressions, were met with immediate, unyielding condemnation from her. I remember one afternoon, during art class, Mark had deliberately smeared blue paint across my freshly drawn landscape, then quickly blamed me, claiming I had bumped his arm. My protests, my tearful explanations, fell on deaf ears. Mrs. Albright, her lips pursed in a thin line, simply shook her head. "Eleanor," she'd said, her voice dripping with disappointment, "why must you always be so disruptive? Mark is a good boy. Perhaps you should look inward, young lady, and consider the darkness you carry." The darkness she spoke of wasn't just a casual remark, it was a recurring theme, a label she'd affixed to me with unsettling frequency. Mrs. Albright was deeply religious, and her faith, while perhaps a source of comfort for her, became a weapon she wielded against me. Any perceived defiance, any instance where I dared to stand up for myself or, God forbid, for another student Mark was tormenting, was immediately twisted into evidence of my inherent wickedness. "You have a spirit of rebellion, Eleanor," she'd declare, her gaze piercing, "a darkness that seeks to sow discord. It is the work of the devil, and you must fight against it." The words would hang in the air, heavy and suffocating, making me feel like an outcast, a pariah in a classroom full of children who, to my young mind, seemed to absorb her every word as gospel. The injustice of it all was a constant, gnawing ache in my chest. How could she be so blind? How could she so readily believe his lies and dismiss my truth? It wasn't just about the punishments, the mistresses, the extra chores, It was about the fundamental unfairness, the feeling of being perpetually misunderstood and unfairly judged. This pattern continued, day after relentless day. Mark would bait me, I would react, and Mrs. Albright would swoop in, her judgment swift and final, always against me. There was the time he tripped a smaller boy on the playground, causing him to scrape his knee. When I rushed to help the boy and pointed out Mark's actions, Mrs. Albright arrived, her face a mask of disapproval. "Eleanor," she'd admonished, pulling me aside while Mark stood by, feigning innocence, "you are always so quick to accuse. Perhaps you should focus on your own behavior. Such negativity, such a desire to see ill in others, it truly is ungodly." The word hung in the air, a silent accusation that branded me. Each incident chipped away at my spirit, replacing youthful exuberance with a quiet, simmering resentment. I learned quickly that defending myself was futile. It only solidified her conviction that I was the problem. The more I tried to explain, the more I tried to assert my innocence, the more entrenched she became in her belief that I was a difficult, troublesome child, a vessel for some unseen malevolent force. The label of the devil wasn't just an insult. It was a prophecy she seemed determined to fulfill, a constant reminder of her unwavering conviction that I was inherently flawed. This constant barrage of unfairness, this relentless chipping away at my sense of self, slowly began to forge something new within me. A quiet resolve, a hardening of the spirit that would eventually seek its own form of justice. The stage was set, the tension building, leading inexorably towards a breaking point, a moment when the unfairness would become too much to bear. The breaking point arrived, as these things often do, in the most mundane of settings, gym class. It was a day like any other, filled with the usual cacophony of bouncing balls and shouting children. We were playing dodgeball, a game that, in our elementary school, often devolved into a chaotic free-for-all. I had recently sustained a minor injury to my wrist, a sprain from an accidental fall during recess, and was wearing a temporary brace, a simple elastic support that offered minimal protection but was a visible sign of my vulnerability. Mark, ever observant, had clearly noticed it. He seemed to relish any opportunity to exploit a weakness, to push boundaries, to inflict a small, unpunished hurt. The game was winding down, and I was near the edge of the court, trying to avoid the last few stray balls. Mark, with a mischievous glint in his eye, suddenly veered towards me. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. He didn't throw a ball, he simply lowered his shoulder and shoved me, hard, directly into the path of a fast-approaching dodgeball. The impact sent a jolt of pain through my already tender wrist, a sharp, searing sensation that made me gasp. I stumbled, nearly falling, the brace digging uncomfortably into my skin. It was a cheap shot, a cowardly act designed to cause maximum discomfort with minimal risk of being caught. My immediate reaction was a surge of white-hot anger, a feeling that had been simmering beneath the surface for months, finally boiling over. "Mark!" I yelled, clutching my wrist. "You did that on purpose." Of course, Mrs. Albright, who was supervising the game with her usual hawk-like intensity, had witnessed the exchange. Or, rather, she had witnessed my reaction. She hadn't seen Mark's initial shove, or if she had, she chose to ignore it. Her eyes, however, were fixed on me, on my outburst, on my pain-contorted face. She strode over, her expression a familiar mask of disapproval, her lips already forming the words I knew were coming. "Eleanor," she snapped, her voice cutting through the gym's noise, "what is the meaning of this outburst? Such aggression is entirely uncalled for." I tried to explain, to articulate the pain, the deliberate nature of Mark's action, gesturing weakly at my wrist. "He pushed me, Mrs. Albright. He pushed me right into the ball, and it hurt my wrist." But my words were met with the same dismissive wave of her hand, the same unwavering belief in Mark's innocence. He stood beside her, a picture of wide-eyed innocence, shaking his head slightly, as if genuinely bewildered by my accusations. "Eleanor," she continued, her voice hardening, "Mark would never do such a thing. He is a kind and considerate boy. This constant negativity, this desire to blame others for your own misfortunes, is deeply troubling. It is a darkness, Eleanor, a darkness that seeks to corrupt. You truly are behaving like the devil himself." The words, familiar as they were, landed differently this time. They weren't just an insult. They were a final, definitive judgment, delivered in front of my peers, cementing my status as the classroom pariah. The pain in my wrist was overshadowed by a far deeper ache, a profound sense of injustice that settled deep within my bones. In that moment, something shifted. The frustration, the hurt, the simmering resentment, it all coalesced into a cold, clear resolve. If she wanted a devil, then a devil she would get. The label, once a source of shame, now felt like a perverse liberation. It was a turning point, a silent vow that the rules of engagement had changed. From that moment on, I would stop fighting against the label and instead embrace it, twisting it into a tool for my own quiet, meticulous vengeance. The game was no longer about proving my innocence, it was about living up to her expectations in the most unexpected and unsettling way possible. The walk home from school that day was different. The usual chatter of children, the bright afternoon sun, the familiar sights of my neighborhood, all seemed muted, distant. My mind, usually occupied with childish concerns, was now a whirlwind of cold, calculated thoughts. Mrs. Albright's words, the devil himself, echoed in my ears, no longer stinging, but instead resonating with a strange, almost empowering clarity. If she saw me as such a malevolent force, then perhaps it was time to stop fighting the perception and instead embody it. Not with overt acts of defiance, not with childish tantrums, but with something far more insidious, something that would strike at the very core of her beliefs, something she would never suspect. The idea, when it first flickered into my mind, felt like a spark igniting in the darkness. It was a whisper of a plan, born from the depths of my resentment, fueled by every unfair punishment, every dismissive glance, every time she had championed Mark over me. I knew Mrs. Albright was deeply religious. Her classroom was adorned with subtle religious iconography, her lessons often peppered with moralistic tales, and her pronouncements about darkness and ungodly behavior were a constant reminder of her spiritual framework. And what, I mused, would be more anathema to her devout sensibilities than the very things she preached against? Things like fortune-telling, spiritualism, the occult, practices she undoubtedly considered to be the work of the very entity she accused me of embodying. My elementary school library, small as it was, became my first clandestine research hub. During quiet reading times, while other children were engrossed in adventure stories or fairy tales, I was meticulously poring over encyclopedias and the few, surprisingly accessible, books on folklore and superstitions. I wasn't looking for spells or curses, I was looking for keywords, for concepts that would trigger her deepest disapproval. Psychic readings, tarot card interpretations, mediumship services, astrology charts, these phrases became my targets. My small, child's handwriting-filled notebook pages with lists, each entry a potential avenue for my silent campaign. The internet, still a relatively new and exciting frontier for a child of my age, was my next and most fruitful hunting ground. Our family computer, usually reserved for educational games or supervised research, became my secret weapon. After my parents had gone to bed, I would creep downstairs, the soft glow of the monitor illuminating my determined face. I learned to clear browser history, to navigate stealthily, to leave no trace of my nocturnal activities. The sheer volume of online services dedicated to these practices was astonishing, even to my young mind. Pages upon pages of spiritual advisors, intuitive healers, destiny readers, each one a potential arrow in my quiver. I compiled a comprehensive list, not just of names, but of their contact methods, email addresses, phone numbers, even physical mailing addresses where available. I imagined her receiving unsolicited mail about unveiling your true destiny or connecting with departed loved ones, and a slow, wicked smile spread across my face. The meticulousness of my planning was almost obsessive. I cross-referenced, I double-checked, I made sure I had every piece of information necessary to ensure these services would reach her directly. It wasn't about a single act, it was about a sustained, relentless barrage, a constant drip of spiritual affronts designed to chip away at her composure. The initial incident with Mark and the gym class outburst faded slightly in my memory, replaced by the exhilarating focus of my new mission. This wasn't just revenge. It was an art form, a silent symphony of subtle torment, orchestrated by a child who had been pushed too far. I was no longer Eleanor, the accused, I was Eleanor, the the architect of a quiet, spiritual rebellion. The initial incident had, as I predicted, blown over. Mrs. Albright, satisfied with her public reprimand and my apparent submission, had moved on, her attention shifting to other classroom dynamics, other perceived infractions. This lull, this period of relative calm, was precisely what I had been waiting for. It allowed me to execute my plan not in the heat of immediate anger, but with the cool, calculated precision of a seasoned strategist. The element of surprise was crucial. She would never connect these unsolicited spiritual bombardments to a seemingly innocent elementary school student. My primary weapon was email. I had discovered, through careful observation and a bit of digital sleuthing, which, for an elementary schooler, mostly involved remembering what she typed on the classroom computer during parent-teacher conferences, her professional email address. It was a standard school district address, easily identifiable and, crucially, one she checked regularly for official communications. Armed with my meticulously compiled list of online psychic, tarot, and medium services, I began the systematic process of signing her up. Each night, after my parents were asleep and the house was quiet, I would slip downstairs to the family computer. The soft glow of the screen became my accomplice, illuminating my focused face as I navigated through various websites. The process was surprisingly simple. Most of these services offered free introductory readings, newsletters, or promotional materials in exchange for an email address. I would visit each site, locate the sign up or subscribe button, and carefully input Mrs. Albright's professional email address. I made sure to uncheck any boxes that might require confirmation links or verification, opting for the most direct, immediate form of subscription. I imagined her inbox, usually filled with mundane school announcements and parent queries, suddenly inundated with subject lines like "Unlock your destiny," "Your future awaits," "Free tarot reading," or "Connect with loved ones beyond the veil." The thought sent a thrill of quiet satisfaction through me. I didn't just sign her up for a few. I signed her up for every single one on my list. Dozens of services, hundreds of potential emails. I varied the times of my subscriptions, spreading them out over several weeks, ensuring a steady, relentless drip of spiritual spam. This wasn't about a single, impactful event. It was about a slow, persistent erosion of her peace of mind. I envisioned her opening her email each morning, her brow furrowing in confusion, then annoyance, then perhaps a creeping sense of unease as the sheer volume of these ungodly solicitations grew. Would she suspect a prank? Perhaps. But would she ever suspect me? A quiet, seemingly well-behaved child, especially after the initial incident had faded? Unlikely. The beauty of it was its untraceability. I used public library computers on occasion, or simply relied on the anonymity of the internet, knowing that tracking an elementary schooler's digital footprint for such a minor, though to her, significant, transgression would be virtually impossible for the school system. Each click of the subscribe button was a tiny act of rebellion, a silent declaration of war against her unfairness. I felt a growing sense of power, a quiet confidence that had been absent for so long. This wasn't the angry, frustrated child who had been berated in gym class. This was a meticulous, patient architect of a subtle revenge. The seeds were sown, and now, all I had to do was wait for them to sprout, to watch the quiet chaos unfold from a safe, undetectable distance. The game had truly begun, and I was playing it with a precision she could never have anticipated. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in observation. I became a silent, watchful presence in Mrs. Albright's classroom, my senses heightened, my attention finely tuned to any subtle shift in her demeanor. My outward behavior remained impeccable. I was the model student, attentive, polite, and seemingly engaged. I offered her the sweetest smiles, a saccharine charm laid on thick, a stark contrast to the simmering satisfaction I felt internally. "Good morning, Mrs. Albright," I'd chirped, my voice bright, my eyes twinkling with an innocence that belied the secret I harbored. "You look lovely today." The compliments were genuine in their delivery, but laced with a hidden irony that only I was privy to. My goal was to blend in, to become invisible in plain sight, allowing the fruits of my digital labor to ripen without suspicion. I watched her closely during morning announcements, during lesson time, during recess duty. I looked for the subtle signs of stress, the telltale indicators that my plan was taking root. At first, there was nothing overtly noticeable. A few days after my initial email barrage, she seemed her usual stern self. But then, gradually, almost imperceptibly, the cracks began to show. I noticed her sighing more frequently, a weary exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of unseen burdens. Her brow, already prone to furrowing, seemed perpetually creased, as if she were constantly wrestling with an invisible problem. During breaks, instead of her usual calm grading or lesson planning, I'd catch her glancing at her phone or, more often, her desktop computer screen, her expression a mixture of confusion and growing irritation. Sometimes, she'd rub her temples, a gesture of exasperation that spoke volumes. The subtle tightening of her jaw, the way her eyes would dart around the room as if searching for an invisible culprit. These were the small victories I savored. The whispers began subtly, filtering through the staff lounge doors during recess, carried by the wind of casual conversation. I'd pretend to be engrossed in a book or tying my shoe near the open door, my ears straining to catch snippets. "Mrs. Albright seems a bit frazzled lately, doesn't she?" one teacher might remark. "Yes," another would reply. "I heard something about her email being flooded with unusual messages." "Oh, you mean those psychic things? I got a few too, but hers seemed to be relentless." The confirmation was sweet, almost intoxicating. My plan was working. The unusual messages were indeed reaching her, and not just her, but apparently some of her colleagues too, though perhaps not with the same overwhelming volume. This suggested that my method of mass subscription was effective, and that the services, in their eagerness for new clients, were casting a wide net. The most telling sign, however, came a few weeks later. During a morning assembly, the principal, Mr. Henderson, made a brief, somewhat awkward announcement. "Good morning, students and staff," he began, clearing his throat. "Just a quick note for our teachers. We've been experiencing some unusual activity with staff email accounts recently. A high volume of unsolicited messages, some of a rather spiritual nature. We're implementing new email security measures, including stronger spam filters, to address this. Please be patient as we roll these out." A wave of murmurs rippled through the staff section. Mrs. Albright, seated in the front row, stiffened. I watched her, a silent observer in the sea of children, and saw a flush creep up her neck. Her eyes, usually so sharp, seemed to glaze over for a moment, a flicker of something akin to defeat crossing her face. It was the best part. I was never caught. The new security measures were a direct consequence of my actions, a clear indication of the scale of the problem I had created for her. I had not only caused her distress, but I had inadvertently forced the entire school system to adapt to my silent campaign. It was the perfect, silent vindication. With the new email security measures being implemented, I knew my direct digital assault was coming to an end. The flood of psychic emails would soon be stemmed, and Mrs. Albright's inbox would likely return to its mundane state. But my revenge wasn't just about the emails, it was about the broader psychological warfare, the subtle erosion of her composure, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had made her life just a little bit more difficult, all while remaining completely undetected. The email campaign had served its purpose. It had rattled her, made her question what was happening, and ultimately forced the school to react. Now, it was time to shift tactics, to move from overt, though anonymous, action to more nuanced, personal manipulation. My focus now turned to Mark, the golden child, the favored student who had been the catalyst for so much of my frustration. Mrs. Albright, in her misguided attempts to foster cooperation, still frequently forced us into study sessions or paired activities. These sessions, once a source of dread, now became a new arena for my subtle machinations. I continued to offer Mrs. Albright my sweetest smiles, my most charming demeanor, especially when she announced our forced collaborations. "Of course, Mrs. Albright," I'd say, my voice light and agreeable, "I'd be happy to help Mark." It was a performance, meticulously crafted, designed to reinforce her perception of me as a helpful, if sometimes misunderstood, student. During these forced study sessions, I began to subtly mislead Mark. He was, in truth, not as bright as Mrs. Albright believed, or perhaps he was simply lazy, relying on her favoritism to smooth over his academic shortcomings. He rarely paid full attention, often distracted or simply waiting for me to do the bulk of the work. This was my opportunity. When we worked on math problems, I'd accidentally point him towards the wrong formula, or subtly misinterpret a key instruction. If we were researching a history project, I'd suggest a source that was slightly off topic or contained misleading information, always with an innocent, helpful air. "Oh, Mark, I think this book has exactly what you need for the Roman Empire section," I'd exclaim, knowing full well it focused on ancient Greece. I never did anything overtly wrong. My mistakes were always plausible, easily dismissed as a child's genuine misunderstanding or a simple oversight. "Oops, my bad, Mark. I thought that was a plus sign, not a minus. Or, I guess that fact wasn't quite right, was it? Silly me." Mark, too lazy to double-check my work and too confident in his own perceived superiority, rarely questioned my help. He would dutifully copy down the incorrect answers or incorporate the flawed information into his assignments. I watched, with quiet satisfaction, as his grades, once consistently high, began to subtly, steadily decline. A B here, a C there, then a few more. It wasn't a precipitous drop, which might have raised immediate alarms, but a gradual, insidious slide that suggested a deeper, underlying problem with his understanding. The beauty of this tactic was its dual impact. Not only was Mark's academic performance suffering, but Mrs. Albright was also becoming increasingly stressed. I observed her during class, her eyes frequently drifting towards Mark's desk, a growing concern etched on her face. She would call him up to her desk more often, whispering to him, her gestures becoming more animated, more exasperated. I could almost hear her internal monologue. "Mark, my golden boy, what is happening? Why are your grades slipping? You're usually so bright." The irony was delicious. Her favored student, the one she believed to be beyond reproach, was slowly, subtly being undermined, and she was completely oblivious to my role in it. The satisfaction of watching her growing stress and his declining grades, all while maintaining my facade of sweet innocence, was the perfect, silent vindication. It was a slow burn, a quiet unraveling, and I was the unseen hand pulling the threads. The decline in Mark's grades was not dramatic enough to cause an immediate intervention, but it was consistent enough to become a persistent source of worry for Mrs. Albright. I watched her, subtly, throughout the day. Her usual stern composure began to fray at the edges. She would call Mark to her desk more frequently, her voice hushed, her gestures growing more agitated. I'd catch snippets of their conversations, always about his homework, his test scores, his lack of focus. "Mark, you usually excel at this," I heard her whisper one afternoon, her voice laced with a mixture of concern and frustration. "Are you paying attention in class? Is everything all right at home?" Mark, ever the innocent, would shrug, offer some vague excuse, and look bewildered, completely unaware of the subtle sabotage at play. The stress manifested in Mrs. Albright in various ways. Her already thin lips seemed to be perpetually pressed into a tighter line. She'd absent-mindedly tap her pen against her desk, a nervous habit that grew more frequent. Her patience, never her strongest suit, seemed to wear even thinner, and she'd snap at other students more readily, her temper shorter than usual. The vibrant colors of her classroom, once a backdrop for her unwavering authority, now seemed to highlight the growing tension in her demeanor. She looked tired, genuinely fatigued, as if she were carrying a heavy, invisible burden. My role in this unfolding drama remained completely hidden. I continued to be the picture of helpfulness, especially towards Mark. "Need help with that, Mark?" I'd offer, leaning over his desk with a look of genuine concern, ready to subtly guide him towards another incorrect answer. "Are you sure you understood Mrs. Albright's instructions? Sometimes she goes so fast." My feigned empathy was flawless, designed to both disarm Mark and reinforce my innocent image should Mrs. Albright happen to glance our way. He would often accept my help with a grunt, too proud to admit he was struggling, too lazy to verify my suggestions. The beauty of this phase of my plan was its self-sustaining nature. Mark's declining grades led to more stress for Mrs. Albright, which in turn made her more distracted and less observant, creating even more opportunities for me to subtly undermine Mark. It was a vicious cycle, and I was the quiet architect of its momentum. I observed the subtle changes in their dynamic. Mrs. Albright's increasing frustration with Mark, her growing disappointment in his performance, a stark contrast to her previous unwavering belief in his brilliance. The golden child was slowly tarnishing, and she couldn't understand why. There was a particular satisfaction in watching her struggle with this enigma. She had built Mark up so high, placed him on such a pedestal, that his academic decline must have felt like a personal affront, a challenge to her judgment. She couldn't blame me. I was the helpful, sweet student. She couldn't blame Mark. He was her good boy. The cognitive dissonance must have been immense, creating an internal struggle that I could only imagine. The psychic emails had been a shock, an external assault on her spiritual comfort. The decline of her favored student, however, was an internal crisis, a slow, agonizing realization that her perfect world was crumbling, and she had no idea why. It was a silent, psychological victory, far more satisfying than any direct confrontation could have been. The vindication was complete, a quiet, pervasive triumph that permeated every corner of her classroom. The school year began to draw to a close, and the atmosphere in Mrs. Albright's classroom, once rigidly controlled, now felt subtly off-kilter. The underlying tension, born from her ongoing struggles with Mark's inexplicable academic slide and the lingering mystery of the email deluge, was palpable. She was visibly more tired, her eyes often red-rimmed, and her voice, usually so firm, sometimes carried a faint tremor of exhaustion. The once impenetrable facade of her unwavering faith and authority seemed to have developed hairline cracks, visible only to a keen observer like myself. I continued my performance, maintaining the sweet, helpful persona that had become my shield and my weapon. My smiles for Mrs. Albright were brighter than ever, my offers of assistance to Mark more frequent and subtly misleading. I even started offering to help other students, further cementing my image as a kind, cooperative child. This allowed me to observe the broader classroom dynamics, to see how her stress was impacting her interactions with everyone. She was less patient, quicker to assign blame, and more prone to lecturing about focus and personal responsibility, though her words seemed to lack their usual conviction. Mark, for his part, was becoming increasingly sullen. The pressure from Mrs. Albright, coupled with his genuine confusion over his slipping grades, was clearly taking its toll. He was no longer the confident, smirking bully. He seemed perpetually annoyed, easily frustrated, and less inclined to engage in his usual petty torments. His attempts at bullying me became half-hearted, easily deflected, and often, he just ignored me, absorbed in his own academic woes. The dynamic between us had shifted. I was no longer his victim, but an unseen force subtly guiding his downfall. It was a delicious irony. One afternoon, during a quiet reading period, I overheard Mrs. Albright on the phone in the hallway, her voice hushed but clearly agitated. I pretended to be engrossed in my book, but my ears strained to catch every word. "I just don't understand it, Reverend," she murmured, her voice laced with desperation. "His grades are plummeting, and he seems so distracted. It's unlike him. And then there's the email situation. It's been relentless, even with the new filters. It feels like a spiritual attack, Reverend. As if something is trying to undermine everything I stand for." A pause. "Yes, I've prayed. Constantly. But it just seems to get worse." My heart gave a quiet leap of triumph. This was it. This was the ultimate validation. She wasn't just annoyed or stressed. She genuinely believed she was under a spiritual attack. The very language she had used to condemn me, darkness, devil, ungodly, she was now applying to her own inexplicable misfortunes. The irony was profound, a perfectly symmetrical reflection of her own judgment. She was experiencing the very darkness she had accused me of embodying, and she was powerless to stop it because she couldn't identify its source. The satisfaction was immense, a deep, quiet contentment that settled over me. I had not sought to physically harm her, nor to overtly disrupt her life in a way that would lead to my capture. Instead, I had orchestrated a silent, psychological campaign that struck at her deepest vulnerabilities: her faith, her authority, and her pride in her favored student. I had turned her own beliefs against her, using them as the very tools of her torment. The vindication was complete, a quiet, pervasive triumph that permeated every corner of her classroom. The final bell of the school year, when it eventually rang, would not just mark the end of classes, but the quiet, undeniable victory of a child who had truly lived up to the name she had been given. The final weeks of elementary school were a blur of year-end activities, field trips, and the bittersweet anticipation of summer break. For me, however, they were also the culmination of my silent campaign, the final act in a drama only I was privy to. Mrs. Albright's stress had reached a peak. She moved through the classroom like a ghost, her usual sharp focus dulled by an underlying weariness. Her lectures became more rambling, her assignments less organized. The once immaculate classroom, a reflection of her rigid control, now seemed to show subtle signs of neglect, a stack of ungraded papers here, a forgotten plant wilting in the corner there. Mark, too, was a shadow of his former self. His grades had continued their slow, steady decline, culminating in a report card that, while not disastrous, was a far cry from the stellar performance Mrs. Albright had come to expect. He was quieter, less prone to bullying, and seemed genuinely confused by his academic struggles. The golden boy had lost his luster, and the weight of Mrs. Albright's disappointment hung heavy over him. I watched them both, a silent observer, my heart filled with a quiet, almost serene sense of accomplishment. The day of the final report cards was particularly telling. Mrs. Albright handed them out with a solemnity that bordered on funereal. When Mark received his, I saw him flinch, his eyes widening slightly as he scanned the grades. He quickly folded it, stuffing it into his backpack, avoiding Mrs. Albright's gaze. She, in turn, looked at him with a mixture of concern and profound disappointment, a look that spoke volumes about her shattered expectations. It was a stark contrast to the beaming pride she used to display when he achieved perfect scores. For my part, my report card was excellent. I had maintained my grades, even excelling in subjects that required meticulous attention to detail, a skill I had honed during my revenge planning. Mrs. Albright handed me my report card with a faint, almost bewildered smile. "Eleanor," she said, her voice softer than usual, "you've had a very good year academically. You've been very helpful." The words felt like a crown of thorns, a testament to her complete obliviousness. I returned her smile, a picture of innocent gratitude, the sweetness almost sickening. "Thank you, Mrs. Albright," I replied, my voice perfectly modulated. "I tried my best." The last day of school arrived, a chaotic mix of farewells and excited chatter. As students streamed out of the classroom for the final time, I lingered for a moment, letting the last few children pass. Mrs. Albright was at her desk, gathering her belongings, her shoulders slumped. She looked up as I approached, her eyes tired. "Goodbye, Eleanor," she said, a faint, weary smile on her face. "Have a good summer." "You too, Mrs. Albright," I replied, my voice brimming with genuine warmth, a warmth that was both real and deeply ironic. "I hope you have a very peaceful summer." The word peaceful hung in the air, a subtle barb, a final, unspoken acknowledgement of the turmoil I had sown. I turned and walked out, leaving her alone in the quiet classroom, surrounded by the lingering echoes of her own unraveling. As I stepped out into the bright sunshine, the weight of the past year seemed to lift. The resentment, the frustration, the feeling of being unfairly targeted, it had all been channeled into a precise, calculated act of revenge. I had not been caught. I had not resorted to childish outbursts. Instead, I had played a long game, a silent, psychological war that had achieved its objective. The vindication was complete, a quiet, pervasive triumph that permeated every corner of her classroom. The final bell of the school year, when it eventually rang, had not just marked the end of classes, but the quiet, undeniable victory of a child who had truly lived up to the name she had been given. I walked away, a new sense of empowerment settling deep within me. The world, I realized, could be manipulated, even by a child, if one was clever and patient enough. This was not the end of my story, but the beginning of a new understanding of power, of justice, and of the profound satisfaction that could be found in the quietest forms of rebellion. My elementary school years were over, but the lessons I learned, particularly the one about living up to a name, would stay with me forever.